So here I am again, back in the car. Gives me an opportunity to film something in natural light, and there's more of it today. But anyway, before I go into any kind of diverse knitter natter waffle, whatever you want to call it, I want to go to the subject straight. I've already waffled too much. So, although this is kind of still talking about, software engineering and kind of my experience, I'm not going to talk about an actual silly, funny experience or whatever you want to call it. This time I'll leave some more for the future. I've got plenty of those sort of stories. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about learning one language well against working in multiple languages. So when I first started in software engineering after I left university, the company or companies really that I kind of worked for were really just working in C and then C++. So the first few were C predominantly, and then the ones after that all started kind of working in C, and then sort of moving into C++, started using object-oriented work, etc. There was a couple of very small projects. One now to do some bits in Perl, and another one in a language called TCL. So I also have an object-oriented version of it. I used to call it Tickle, I think was the language, but TCL. Is it called TCL Plus, the object-oriented version? It's been over 20 years ago, so my brain is a little bit fuzzy on that. But apart from those two sort of projects, it was predominantly C and C++. Well, up until what would it be? 2011 maybe. So the first 14, 15 years of my career was C and C++. And although there was another project actually, which I didn't do the work on, but there was some C#, and I supported, but I didn't actually do any of the coding. But C# was just sort of getting kind of its foothold at that sort of late 2000s, I think, when I was sort of started seeing more of it being produced. But anyway, so yeah, C++, and I can, I kind of hold my hat out to people that dedicate their entire development career to one language, learn it very, very well, and using it. But in my personal opinion, and this is just my personal opinion, it can be a bit limiting on a career because you always have to find roles that have that particular language. Now, don't get me wrong, some languages like, say, Java, C#, there's plenty of work out there. But I would say the same as C++ when I was first starting out. There were so many companies that were using C and C++. And although it's still used now, I find less companies advertising those sort of roles, and it's more Java and C# roles and Python and so on. Now, after 2013, I think it was, or so, I started working for another company where the projects were very dependent on the language. So most of the projects were coming in sort of there was a language which I can't remember now. It's I only ever used it there, and it was a GUI based one, and I never really did a lot in it because it was horrible. But most of them, the other ones were like Java, some C# and Python. And since then, I've done roles where I've been working in C# and doing stuff like ASP.NET and C# desktop applications. I've worked in roles where there's been Python, and I've worked in roles where there's been Java and things like Spring Boot, Java Spring Boot. And at the moment we're working, I've done some C#, there's some Ansible, and there's other things, and all these languages, it's getting to your kind of to a place where you can use multiple languages allows you to have, more opportunities. And from my perspective, the language itself is just syntax. In all those languages, the way you design and develop the code is very similar in that, they all have a similar structure. Obviously, Python's a little bit different to, say, C#, Java, and C++, but they all have a very similar kind of structural ideal behind them. And then the code is the languages is the syntax to develop the code. And don't get me wrong, each language has its own kind of uniqueness and the way it does things, and there's things you can do in one language easier than another language, and so on. So I'm not saying any specific language is better than another, but being able to kind of cross code, I think, is far more career driving your career than actually just dedicating to one language. But not saying that you won't have a good career if you just dedicate yourself to one language, because you can become quite an expert in say one thing like Java or C#. But also using multiple languages can also keep the interest there, because one project might be in C#, next one in Python, next one in Java, and so on. So it can actually have a better interest value if you wanted to do that anyway. But that's just my opinion, and that's the way I kind of work now. I've worked at companies, and my skills have gone to different languages, and I'm always doing some personal projects in one language or another language, just to keep my head working in an understanding. And it also means that whenever I go somewhere, whatever language is written in, you can sort of have a foothold to start with. But yeah, that's just my own thoughts, and this was one thing I wanted to share. Don't limit yourself to one language. Be able to code in multiple languages and have that skill set. But that's this week's segment. What am I talking about? Learn multiple languages, keep your interest up. LeetCode's a good place. I always find to do the same thing in multiple different languages. Same problem in multiple different languages. Always see that kind of interesting kind of difference. Right, I'm going to go now. I'll catch you at least next Wednesday, or maybe I'll do some code stuff. Who knows? Bye for now.